excited and very glad to welcome you all to this session, which is on reforming energy for development. We have been planning this now for several months, and I'm very excited to introduce all the speakers who've joined us from different parts of the world, and they've been working on Pakistan's energy sector, and so we hope to learn from them today. So first off, we have Dr. Naveed Arshad, who's at the LUMS Energy Institute, and he will be presenting the first talk. I will hand it over to him shortly. After that, we have Ijlal Naqvi, who's joining us from Singapore Management University. Ijlal is a sociologist. And then we have Robyn Meeks and Javed Younas, who will be essentially finishing up with the final presentation today. I would also like to add that this panel is truly interdisciplinary because we in the panel we have people from computer science, engineering background. We have people from apart from economics, other social sciences. So I hope that we can all learn and benefit from this sort of like integrated approach, more holistic approach to understanding the challenges of the energy sector and what's to be done. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Naveed Arshad to begin the first talk. Each speaker will have 20 minutes, and we will try to keep ourselves on track with the time, so I will have a time, and I'll keep track of that. And then after the talks are finished, we'll have a brief discussion and then open up for Q&A to the general audience. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Dr. Ayesha, for giving me opportunity to present this work. And thank you all for joining us in this work. So my name is Naveed Arshad. I am part of the School of Science and Engineering in the Computer Science Department, but I also work with the LUMS Energy Institute, and we work on a number of challenges that the energy sector is facing. We are not looking at primarily just the research side of things, I mean the research which is the published papers and stuff, but we are also looking at from a more pragmatic perspective of how to solve these problems. So, so can I have a clicker, or are you going to? Okay. All right. That will be a bit challenging in some slides, but we'll try to find. So we work on a number of aspects, and that's include planning and the capacity building of the power sector. Please go to the next slide. We have close working relationship with almost all power sector entities. So we work very close with the industry and the government in this aspect. So next slide, please. So I'll just give you maybe a half a minute power sector 101. And that's where I think probably if I have the clicker, then it will be easier. But if you can press another button. So in any power sector, this is the graph that you see. So basically, the dark line that we have. Okay, give me the clicker. I think I'll just use the. It's working? Okay, thank you. That will be much. Thank you very much. So this is the load curve for any particular day. And these are the resources that we have for fulfilling that load, so that we have the generation and the load under balance. So we have nuclear, renewables, and then on top of that, we have lots of fossil fuel generation and stored hydro. So as soon as the demand goes up, new generation resources comes along, and then when the load goes down, those are turned off. So this is how the power sector works. The problem is that this line, this bold line, you cannot store electricity in large scale. So electricity has to be consumed the moment it is produced. And that's one of the biggest challenge, that how can you have a generation system that can follow this curvy line and make sure that everybody's demands are fulfilled. Whenever we turn on a button, the light is already there. And the average of all these resources that we are using, it's something what we call WSCG, which is weighted average cost of generation. That's kind of an average, a little above average, because the plants have different costs and operation. So this is one slide. Now, if we look in Pakistan, this is our supply curve outlook in the next few years. We have a lot of generation coming up. Currently, we are about 35,000 megawatt of generation, but we have a number of new plants that are adding up in Pakistan. So by 2030, our generation will be touching about 60,000 megawatt. On the other hand, the blue line is the generation capability, because if the plants are there, we cannot run them unless we have some prerequisites. And According to that, we have some load, which is the orange part. But what is important to see are these excess capacity that we are having. So this is the excess capacity we have in the system. And if we see it another way, this is the percentage of excess capacity that we'll have after fulfilling our load. And that, if you see, and nowhere it is less than about 15%. In some cases, it's only going 60%, 63%. Now, this capacity is perfectly fine because, I mean, having capacity is good, but the problem is, if you can press the next slide, please, is the financial implications. And the financial implications are huge. So in power sector, whenever we pay for an electricity plant, we have to take two prices. One is the capacity payment, and then the energy payment. Capacity payment is kind of a payment that is just gone. I mean, you have to pay it just because the plant is there. Energy payment is when you use fuel, and those fuel is procured, and you have to pay for it. The blue line shows the capacity payments of Pakistan. So we are right now here, which is about 800 billion capacity payments, and similarly about 700 in energy payments. But because we are installing too much capacity in our system, these capacity payments are going to go to about 1,600 billion in just the next 8 years. And energy payments are going to be flat because most of our new plants are going to be hydro-based, and because the fuel is free, that's you can say the water. And the price of energy, the main component is going to be the capacity payment. So too much capacity, and we do not have the load to fulfill it. Please go ahead. Agli slide pe chale jaye. So if you understand this curve, you can probably understand half of the problems of the power sector of Pakistan. This is then hourly dispatch, which means that hourly supply of electricity for the past 5.5 years. So these are the variations, the blue line. So in winter, for example, if we are, let's say, using our base load is about 7,000, the maximum is about 10,000 to 12,000. And this load is about 8,000 megawatt, which is the lowest load ever recorded in the power sector across the year. Next slide, next one, please. The maximum load at winters is about 12,000 megawatt. Next, please. And then we have a peak load of 24,560 watt. That was the maximum load that was dispatched. And the total demand in the system is about 30,000 megawatt. Now, the problem is that this 12 and 8,000 is the real load of the system, which include industry and your houses and my house and other things. Next slide, please. There is a gap of 18,000 between the total demand in the system and this 12,000. Where is that load coming from? That load is the cooling load that we use, mostly air conditioning. And that air conditioning is actually creating a lot of problems in our system. You can say the steep peaks here, which means that system is not sustainable. Unless we improve this 8,000 to 12,000 and 12,000 up, this power sectors continue to be plagued in the problem part. By the way, there's nothing to do with theft and everything. Those are secondary problems from our perspective. So next slide, please. And then we have climate change. I just threw in a slide because there is another reference I would like to make. Every planning that we do has to be with climate change in mind, because that's something that's going to hitting us bad, unfortunately. So, 4 trillion rupees in circular debt, 2.4 trillion in the power sector, 1.6 trillion in the gas sector, increasing at an astonishing rate of 2 to 3 billion rupees daily. By the time we finish today, another 2 billion is going to be added to our circular debt. And by the way, it's not circular, it's a debt. Circular is naam pad gaya, but it's actually a debt that we owe to somebody. Dark clouds on the horizon in the power sector. Is there any ray of hope? Of course, but the thing is that we have to focus more on the future solution rather than the past problems. The problem is most of the talks that I go to, they just talk about the previous problem and not about actual interventions that we can do right now. So the Prime Minister Office approached us through an entity called IPRI and said that why don't you run this Grand National Dialogue of Energy for us? We ran that dialogue for the past 3 months, and along with a lot of research that we conducted ourselves, we developed a framework which we can suggest some improvements to the power sector, in fact, the energy sector of Pakistan. There are some quantifiable interventions which are based on quite high granularity data, authentic, verifiable data, and then some non-quantifiable interventions that where the data is not sufficient, and sometimes it's just common sense to use those kind of interventions. Next slide, please. We are looking at 7 parameters. I'm sorry, I'm going fast because I have too many slides, and please let me know when 5 minutes are remaining. We're looking at 7 different parameters that any intervention that we do, whether this will impact these parameters or not, or in which way. So energy efficiency and conservation, that's one thing. Organizational efficiency, which means that all organizational efficiency of the whole power sector, if that is impacted. Energy is not necessarily bad if you use it in a productive way. So productive use of energy is another one. Industrial development, renewable energy use, import reduction, and by import reduction we means that import reduction of the oil product, which is $26 billion. And finally, emission reduction. So we have been working with decision makers a lot, and what we realize is that you have to talk in very, very simple terms. Although you can do a lot of research, but when we are talking to them, you have to talk with very, very simple terms so that they can understand. Somehow they are not liking me, these clickers today. So we have developed this very simple framework where we said that, okay, there are 2 dimensions to it. One is the investment, and then one on the y-axis we have the time, and then there are 4 quadrants here on top, 2, 3, 4, 5. And any kind of intervention can land in any of these quadrants. So you may require a lot of time and a lot of investment. You require less time and less investment. And then in the impact, is that a very, very high impact, that's transformational impact, or it's a profound impact, or it's a focus that it's impact just one area and give you some benefits. But we also are cognizant of the fact that, so we have a fiscal deficit. Government does not have a lot of money. So what can we suggest that can maybe impact in 0 time and 0 investment? And that's the very first quadrant, which actually is just at the 0, 0, but that's too small to put, so we have just put in a separate box there. Next slide, please. So examples of that are, for example, the 0 time 0 investment is through one notification, you can say that, okay, the speed on highways or motorways is going to be not 120, but 100 kilometers. That's going to save some money. How much money? Is going to be a huge impact or not? That's something that we calculate. And then other quadrants are already also there. I'm not going to discuss too much on these because this is not the focus of the talk today. Although we have done a lot of work on the other quadrants as well. Aage chaling, please. So 0 time 0 investment. Is this a magic wand? No. So 0 time means that any time when this is notified, so an intervention is notified, the benefits are going to come right away. But if you want to make some legislative changes, or some change in the rules, or delays in the paperwork, that's not counted. 0 investment means that we don't have to take a loan from World Bank or XYZ Bank. We don't have to allocate funds from our PSDPs or ADPs of the provinces. No need for aid from USAID. The only investment is the time investment from the personnel. So let's look at these 0 time 0 investment. We have made about 12 of them. So I'm going to go through them and tell you. So now, whatever savings we are showing you, they are based on quite verified data. So number one, and maybe a smaller intervention, is just change in the commercial activity timing. Harder to do? I don't know. But it's something that's going to save us maybe $36 million. If we just change the commercial timing to daylight hours, that's going to give us that much savings. Number 2, and this is a kind of an interesting one. You know, in your home bill, you must have received a peak hour and off-peak hours. Those peak and off-peak hours are actually quite old. They are no longer now the real peak hours and off-peak hours. So it means that we are generating electricity at a higher cost, but selling it at a lower cost. So the peak hours that are notified are the red ones that you see, but in the green ones there are other peaks that have now popped up. We are not charging that. If we just start charging those peak hours, we are going to get just another about $6.34 million just by charging the right peak hours. I mean, no rocket science, just the proper billing in the system. So these are two. The third one is related to renewable energy. So we talk about a lot about renewable energy, and the current government is also targeting 10,000 megawatt of solar energy. The implications are that this will have a lot of technical impact on the power sector, which means that if you look at here, this is the graph from Massachusetts, and in 2012, their curve is like this, but then as more solar added, their daytime requirement of electricity started going down. And in 2020, it gone down so much that in fact, they go from 20,000 or 22,000 to only 12,000 megawatt. But all that load shifts back to the grid in the evening time. So evening time, they actually have a lot of load requirements, and in the technical term, we need that how many power plants to start to meet this demand. And that is a ramping that is quite unprecedented. In just 2-3 hours, you are going from 12,000 megawatt to about 26,000 megawatt. In technical terms, this is very, very difficult to do without huge investments. So while renewable energy is good, this is the technical price you have to pay. But fortunately, in Pakistan, we can address this to a certain extent by just one change in our rules. And that is the water batteries that we have in Pakistan. And that's the Mangla and Tarbela. They do a lot of things, more than water storage. But in future, there will also be a lot of usage in terms of using this renewable energy more appropriately, not just in the evening, but also in the intermittent hours. And how do we do it? Just one change in the way water is released in the dams, we can actually use this. And next slide, please. So currently, we provide a 24-hour quantity of water release from IRSA, which is Indus River System Authority. If we just convert it to 48 hours, we can save, ugly slide pe chale jaye. We can save about ₹1 billion. Calculation mein ki hai, but that's about ₹1 billion saving across every month. And that reduces the weighted average cost of generation by ₹1. And ₹1 may seem very less, but for the system level, it's quite high. So cost of generation is another thing. Ugly slide pe chale jaye, I think. So this is another slide where we are just suggesting that if we just remove the 5% load from the peak hours and shift them to off-peak hours through incentives, through you can say pricing or other things, another big saving is possible. And those are flexible loads. You can just shift them without much problem. And we did a complete study on it. Uski agli slide pe chalte hain, I'll just show the total. So about 78 billion rupees by just shifting the 5% of the peak hour load to the off-peak hours. Aage chalenge. So I'll just skip this speed reduction on motorways. Us pe chale jaye next wale pe. This is a very small one, so all of us get the bill. So KE has reduced their expenses on billing by about 300 million a year by just reducing the bill page by half. If we do that across our gas and electricity customer, another $15.78 million saving. But these are the big ticket items now we are getting into. The single most impact of electricity in Pakistan is because of the temperature. And this temperature has a 93% correlation with the electricity demand, which means that 93% of, if you predict the temperature right, you can predict what's electricity demand by just margin of 7% error. We believe we can use it much more efficiently, and by the way, this is true for spring and summer. In winters and autumn, it is slightly different, but our main usage is actually in summer. So, what can we do? We can use cooler mornings more effectively. And this is something where we are suggesting to shift Pakistan's official time to our daylight saving time, but this is going to be a permanent daylight saving time. It's going to be stay on as GMT +6. Are we the first one? No. There are many countries in the world that have done it. Turkey, Morocco, Singapore, Argentina, which are very famous because of the Football World Cup. But let's go to the benefits of it. Now, this is the reduction in the amount of energy that we are going to be using if we start 1 hour earlier. And this is the excess energy that we'll be using in the afternoons when you can say that's the afternoon hours. An impact of $121 million, that's not too much, if you ask me, but there is another impact that we are going to have, and that is that in Pakistan we have another advantage, that we are in the tropics, and our whole day office hours are during the daylight hours. But the thing is that if we change it even in winters, we can get more energy harvesting, more usage of energy from the solar plants that we're installing of 10,000 megawatt. And that is that we will be getting about 16% more energy if we start early in our day. And next, please. That's about an impact of about $250 million if we do it. That means that we'll be saving that from the fuel that we'll be importing. Next slide, please. And then emissions. If you use more solar energy, we can trade those emissions. And the emission amount that we'll be trading, that's about $34 million. And then this is, that cost total about $400 to $500 million. This one is a counterintuitive one, so I'll spend maybe a couple of minutes on it. In our analysis, this is the heat map of the hourly loads of which has been dispatched from NPCC, which is National Power Control Center. We talk about productivity a lot, right? We talked about productivity in this conference. I heard that word a lot. You see this, you can say light-colored hours here? That's on a Friday. This means that energy is not being used, which means that productivity is not taking place. And this is more profound when we go to Karachi, which is, you can say, a city where there's a total working day. You look at these hours, and then these hours are also lighter compared to the other hours. According to our estimate, we are losing 3 to 4 hours of productivity every week. Everybody. At LUMS, my office hours are 9 to 5. I get 2 hours for a Friday prayer break, and somebody is paying for it. Everybody in Pakistan is subsidized for praying Friday prayers. Good or not, I don't know. But we thought that, okay, if we just shift the holiday from, let's say, the weekly holiday from Sunday to Friday, what's going to be the impact on terms of energy usage, and then how do we calculate the impact on the productivity of our labor force? There's another problem. By the way, on Friday, number of accidents also are highest on Friday, by the way, just because of the panic. And this is probably the most shocking fact. Our kids study 1 year less because we give them 2 or 3 hours early break on Fridays. So a person who's 14 years of education, agar 2 saal aap count kar lein for the pre-Ks, 1 year less education. If you ask me, it's quite a lot. Aage chalein ji. So if we change this, go to the benefits of it. So we'll probably will get another $500 million into our economy if we do this. I'll not spend too much time on it, but nudging is another way of having another better energy usage. This is something that the governments have been using. We think that if you save water, you are saving energy also. Water saving leads to energy saving. And nudging is actually made famous from this book by Thaler and Sunstein. And even in the Obama days, they actually made a whole department in the US government that just thought how to nudge people to good behavior, whether it's food behavior or energy behaviors. And so we also did some gas wale bill pe le jaye. So Pakistan has very few gas remaining. So I asked my team, Dr. Kiran is here, that if we want to create a nudge on our electricity or gas bill, on the other side it's just empty, what can we do? So this is something of a nudge. For example, Pakistan has just few days of gas remaining, but we don't tell it to our consumers. But if we tell them, maybe we'll find that there will be a saving. We sell our gas to our consumer at 121 rupees. Internationally, the same gas is available at maybe 2,000 or sometimes 5,000, depending on international market prices. So nobody knows that the gas we are getting is actually 40, 50 times more expensive in the outside world. And there are many other nudges that, so this nudging also will lead to a lot of saving if we do it rightly and we customize it, the bill according to the person. Again, no need for any investment because we already have the information. We just need to present the information in the right way. आगे चलें. So far the things I've mentioned, most of them are relatively painless. But this one is the most painful from the political angle. But this is the most required one. Since we have only 10-year reserves of gas, we need to use them judiciously. If we don't use them, there's no fertilizer, and there's no free cheap power, and there are many other impacts also. Of course, we don't have any gas in our stoves and other things. So we have developed a whole gas load management policy. I'm not going to the detail of it, but which essentially says, आगे चलें ज़रा, फिर आगे चलें, that we just reduce the consumption in the domestic sector by a wide margin, because that is only giving us about $98 million compared to power generation, which is giving for the same amount almost 835, and then industrial tariffs are also giving us more money. So time is up, so I'll just go to my conclusion. Solar net metering is another thing, I'll skip that. And finally, this one is also important. We have about 4 to 5 gigawatt of captive power in our country. That means that the industrialists have installed their own power plants. Because they get cheap gas, they can produce cheap electricity. If we somehow incentivize them and also give them reliability, we can bring them onto the grid. And that's immediate improvement in the grid load that we are asking for. That's about 2,000 megawatt to aa jana chahiye, and then go for the 4,000 or 5,000 megawatt also. I'll skip that, but in total, if we, let's say, have these 0 times 0 investment, we can get a saving of about $2 billion a year. चलें हमने बहुत ज़्यादा इसको कह दिया कि बहुत ज़्यादा हमने ऊंची छोड़ दी है, तो हाँ $1 billion भी कर दें, but $1 billion saving by doing nothing is, I hope, pretty much acceptable. जी, thank you.
All right, good afternoon. My name is Ijlal Naqvi. I'm an associate professor of sociology at Singapore Management University, and also have the pleasure of being a fellow at the Movable Haq Center. And I thank Ali Chima and Shandana for inviting me, and for everyone else who organized the conference. I'm so glad Ayesha identified the interdisciplinary nature of this conference, because as a sociologist, following a computer scientist and an engineer, it was so interesting because I have this deep skepticism that is being tuned from years of reading about it, about technical solutions for technical problems. So I love the fact that Dr. Naveed is offering so many solutions, frankly, right? Whereas the social scientist is trying to say, oh, it's not going to work and that's not going to work. Because in Musharraf time, we tried this daylight savings thing, and it was just utter madness. Ji, aap kis time khulenge? New time, old time, maghrib ke baad aa jao yaar. You know, we're going back to the old time, because that was the only way to communicate in that kind of environment. But we need solutions like that if we're going to make any progress. And even the skeptical social scientist has to try. So this is an area I've been working on for a good few years, but I come at it from the perspective of trying to look at electricity as a perspective on state capacity in particular, and I focused on the material infrastructure of electricity at multiple levels of analysis. I'm primarily a qualitative scholar, although there is some mixed methods work in here as well. Slide, please. All right, so what will I do for you? I'll give you a little bit of the theoretical framework that I've put together for this talk. I go through 3 levels of analysis, which I think all contribute to understanding the challenges of the power sector in different ways. The individual, their experience at the offices of the Islamabad Electric Supply Company, that's where I did my field work. At the city level of analysis, there's the Kachi Abadis that I was looking at. They were interested in regularization, which is a phenomenon that Kachi Abadis are pushing for all over Pakistan. At the national level, I think the focus is on an interprovincial political economy of power. And I'll be looking at that. I'll leave you with 3 takeaways about theory, policy, and work that I want to continue to do. All right, thanks. Slide. All right, so what do I mean by state capacity? I'm mainly looking at Michael Mann's definition of infrastructural power. What this boils down to is, like, what can the state actually do? Not on paper, but in reality, what can it actually achieve? And one reason that I ended up looking at losses was that I wanted to study a way that the state matters in everyday lives in Pakistan. So my original thought was that I was going to work on taxes. This is a long time ago. But as we've been hearing, many people don't pay their taxes. Most people don't. But almost everybody is reliant on the grid, rich, poor, and otherwise. And so what is the definition of losses? Losses are electricity that's supplied to the system but not billed. Okay? It's a different question of whether or not you pay your bill. I'll come to that later, but this is the definition of losses. This is the most pervasive data or the most key metric in power systems in terms of understanding the distribution company's functioning. Right, so the losses are broken up into technical and non-technical losses. Technical losses are low, less than 3% usually. Non-technical is the stuff I'm interested in. This is all the human factor. This is governance, this is administration, this is everything like that. And so across Pakistan in 2015, which is the data point that I was using for comparison, it was under 20%. It's declined marginally, but those numbers are fairly sticky. So yesterday, in particular, Mr. Ismail was saying that Pakistan's government is terrible, terrible, terrible. And don't want to argue with that necessarily, but if you look at transmission and distribution losses specifically, we are within the 95% confidence interval of the line of best fit that goes through a scatter plot of per capita GDP and electricity losses. We look a lot like other countries that are in this level of development. And our South Asian neighbors are around, a little higher, a little lower, and so on. Next slide. So when I approached this work, sort of the dominant narrative in development, then certainly, and I think still now, relies on an understanding of governance that's driven by institutions, and institutions particularly understood as formal rule-based systems. So there was this great study that came out of IDS in 2010, reviewing a decade or more of programming with many, many millions of dollars invested therein. And the bottom line was that these reforms don't work. They don't work because they're focused on formal rule changes. They don't work because they're imposed from the outside, and so on. And that conclusion I don't think has changed. Right, so what did I do instead? I wanted to look at the state as a set of nested fields. So what's a field? A field is an arena of conflict. By introducing conflict, it's explicitly political, it's relational, we're talking about power, we have actors with different levels of power and interest within this system who will make those rules work for them in different ways, right? So the rules of the game are an emergent property of this system. Okay, I followed the material infrastructure of electricity through this environment. And what that is to look at electrical power systems, infrastructure really, as both cause and effect of social change. And in this sense, what you see in an infrastructure are sort of embedded choices of values, of political values. And they embody, reinforce, and enact social and political power, right? And different material infrastructures have different characteristics. So an electrical infrastructure will have different characteristics to water, to telecommunications, and so on. And for electricity specifically, I want to identify the fact that Pakistan has a single national grid. And a single grid must maintain a constant frequency across the entirety of that grid. So there is, in essence, because of this infrastructural choice, a way in which there is a necessary inclusion of all parts of that grid on the same level. Go on. Right. So another comment that came up yesterday was that the government doesn't work. This is something, again, to challenge and to come up with a different interpretation of, in which the point I want to make is that the weakness of government or its absence, its unevenness, it's not an absence. It's part of the whole. So when you break things down at a subnational level, the glaring spatial inequalities that we see are part and parcel of this system, right? This is inequality by design. Catherine Boone wrote about that. And so it's not according to a blueprint, but it's the result of intentional choices, right? It's a very, the decisions that took us there are strategic and intentional. So Pakistan works, but the question is to whose benefit? And that's a question that comes out of Africanist literature, political economy from Chabal and Deleuze, and also by Art. So what is the Pakistan state achieving? It's reproducing the relations of domination. So it does work, but it works in this way. All right, what did I do? I ran around the offices of the Islamabad Electric Supply Company for probably around 18 months, which is far too long. They were sick of me. I was tired of going there, but we went there all the same. I lived in Islamabad for about 4 years. And the other thing I did in that time, which is relevant to this work, is that I worked on power sector reforms at the Ministry of Water and Power as a consultant on a USAID project for power sector reforms, which was a very instructive but ultimately fruitless exercise. Okay, go on. So how do you get work done, at least at the individual level? So one thing you're going to do is you're going to show up in person, right? This is not done remotely. It isn't done at a distance. You have to go there. And most of what I saw is you ask nicely. Basically, you have to communicate directly in person with an XDO or an XCN or whoever it is, and you're dealing with them in person. They are constantly engaging with these individual requests. Maybe 2 cell phones ringing non-stop. This is how they spend their day. Sir, can we please pay our bill in installments? Is probably the most common request. And the answer is yes, because at least you're offering to pay the thing. I'll move on. Okay, so what happens also is that you can see the language of the state present, particularly in Islamabad, which has probably more ethnic diversity than many of locations. So if 2 people share a background, they will speak that language, definitely. Urdu is the common ground. English words are inserted into sentences from elsewhere. But the terms of service are most definitely written in English, right? But they're not engaged with. They may as well be in a foreign language. Not even the staff are really referring to them in any way, although they certainly know how the rules work. Okay, so what happens at the office when these characters are, Bilal is a line superintendent who processes the applications. In this case, it's for a new connection that's going to be done. He doesn't want to do something that Chima wants to do. Chima is an odious character who's a fixer, runs around on the behalf of elites trying to get their work done. And so what Babar's response is like, no, this thing connection's over 20 meters, you can't do it. And then he switches from Urdu to English because he's trying to reach for a register of power and authority by accessing these formal language of the state. Chima's response is, apni English na mere saath shuru karna, right? Don't start, right? And he gets shut down. That work is going to be done that way. Go on. So in the city, right, this is a conversation with a community leader from the Kachibadi where I was going. So what he's saying about his desire to regularize his property, that it will allow him to use that investment in other ways, you know, he's practically quoting Hernando de Soto. And what he's aware of is he doesn't have this no objection certificate, so he's forced to work in an informal manner. And the solution that came out there was because basically what the IESCO found is that they cannot actually disconnect this community. You have to serve them. There's sort of a moral human obligation to serve them. And what they did was they gave them a single paid meter at a commercial rate, and then the functions of the distribution company were internalized by the community who ran their own committee and managed their own wiring within the Kachibadi. All of this is completely contrary to the rules of service, right? But this is the only way that it gets done. Go on. And so individuals within that Kachibadi were still trying to get individual connections, formal metering connections. And so one of them did succeed. But then what happens is that they got slapped with a bill for electricity that they patently didn't consume. So what happens now? Those poor guys had to negotiate with the representatives of the bureaucracy, and they were ineffective in doing so. So entering a formal relationship with the state is actually participating in a game of a slightly different flavor, which not everybody is well equipped to do. So what they did was they retreated to informality, right? They went back to the communal metering system because they knew they weren't going to be abused in that specific way. And this is not unusual, right? So we see other people who, for example, have been given compensatory plots when their Kachibadi is moved for some kind of construction. These guys got plots in F10. They sold it so that they could go back to living in a Kachibadi because they realized the value of that asset which they needed for other things, right? So this is a steel mill owner. He has an MBA from the US and a Land Rover parked outside, right? And what he's talking about is that when he's getting his work done, he says the basis of it is entirely money. But he's very clear about this. He's not asking them to do things that are unpermitted, right? What he's asking them to do are things that he considers his rights. This is the things that he should be getting done, but he has to pay to get them done, and certainly in a timely manner, right? So how does the citizen secure service delivery? The communal arrangements are actually very popular in a way. This is some version of what Beria Town does. It's some version of what Model Town does. And the naval colony in E7, where individual officers don't have to engage with the state, right, on a direct basis, is another version of the same thing, right? So you can steal, but it's usually with the involvement of the electricity company employees. And then, in the end, you get this negotiated compromise: language, power, rents, violence, connections. This is how you navigate the state. Go on. So at the national level, it's a little bit different. So this is a map. On the left side, it's of transmission and distribution losses across the entirety of Pakistan. And so you can see it's the Punjab that basically gets billed for the electricity that's being delivered, whereas the other parts of the country have a slightly mixed level and lesser levels of even being billed. The thing on the right is who actually pays. You get billed, do you actually pay? On the right, it's what you're seeing is that almost none of the country, there's like the vast majority of the country is simply not paying for its electricity consumption, but the Punjab is. So if I take away the legend from this, if I take away the title, What else can you see? What map could this be, right? It could equally be a map of stunting. It could be a map of functional literacy at age 5. This is the entirety of the social contract of this country represented in terms of spatial inequality in space. This is one reason why I think literacy is an effective way of studying that. And it comes to a line I took from Mover over there, which is that the central political conflict at the national level is between the provinces and the center, wherein the articulations of challenge on the grounds of ethnicity and particularity are suppressed. These are old patterns in Pakistan, going back to, as someone speaking on taxes yesterday mentioned, East Pakistan and the separation of Bangladesh. Their objection to the way that financial awards were being made based on their income contributions, and language as well as a part of that, right? There's a single national identity that drives some of these structural arrangements for how electricity is organized. And this is a diagram that represents the cash flow, because it's very much a question of cash flow, as Dr. Naveed was talking about. And so in here, back in the good old days when we relied on domestic gas, the leakage effectively in this system was small enough that we could basically afford to manage to continue. But what circular debt represents is our inability to manage those leakages in anything like a functional manner. And the accumulation of subsidies, and particularly the vulnerability to price spikes that are due to energy, the energy market. The greater the exposure to the international energy market, the less we're able to deal with those costs. All right, let's go on. But even as these sort of national level reforms are pushed, the political economy at the provincial level is ignored, right? So when we do look at electricity bills and losses as a proxy for the social contract, you see something else, is that generation across the country is part of a common generation pool. So we don't say that, Punjab's generation is only for Punjab or Sindh's generation is only for Sindh. It's shared in that way, and resources across the system are shared. And they're integrated into this common grid, which has to function at in a synchronized manner, right? And that is mirrored on the consumer side by the tariff differential subsidy, which is the single largest subsidy that drives all of this debt. And what that entails is that each consumer is paying the same amount regardless of the condition of supply. So this environment is very much a political compromise and bargain. So when we are constantly given prescriptions of eliminating these subsidies, there's actually an underlying political economy which is extremely important to the social contract of the country. And if you break down the further levels of subsidies, Baloch tube wells as a way of co-opting elites into an engagement with the state. Similarly, formerly FATA, now the merged areas, that they didn't pay consumer electricity was because the law essentially didn't apply there. On the maps, it was written that the law of Pakistan doesn't apply, right? So we're not charging them for their electricity either. Okay, go on. So I wanted to use Sahiwal coal as an example of the expansion of capacity which has happened, because this was the first CPEC project. Go back one. And these cooling towers are gigantic. They're about 50 stories high. They don't belong in this landscape in any way, shape, or form. They're the tallest thing, or at least when it was built, it was the tallest thing basically between Karachi and Islamabad, right? And the fact that they're plonked down in the middle of the agricultural heartland and that you have to bring coal by train 1,000 kilometers to service them is ridiculous. But is this a question of infrastructural power, right? Has the state shown its capacity to achieve what it says it will achieve? And I'm going to say no. And the key line here is this is a billboard that exists within that the campus of that power plant. And the key line is up here. I'm sorry, it's small, you can't see it. But this is the Sahiwal spirit. What it says is the patriotic spirit of being loyal to the party and winning glory for the country. Which party? PTI? Was it a Noon League project? No. Chinese Communist Party, right? That's whose infrastructural power is represented in Sahiwal spirit. Okay, so in terms of conclusions, leave you with three things. One was the value of thinking about fields in terms of recognizing to whose benefit the system works, and ensuring that power and conflict are part of that discussion. Second, I didn't get a chance to go into this, but there's a non-climate argument to be made for renewables, which is all about cash flows, right? Solar, wind, etc. You don't need to pay, in essence, for its continued production. So whatever cash flow problems Pakistan has now and will continue to have, no doubt, right, don't affect the capacity of the renewable power plants to continue to contribute. And that's a very important criteria which we haven't paid a lot of attention to. So in terms of future plans, this is about my work, and I was hoping that Khurram Dastgir would be here, but never mind, I'll speak as if he is. Next slide. This is work that I've done in Karachi that's a little bit different to what I was just describing. So this set of maps is based on a series of regressions, which is a spatial model that shows the extent to which, basically who's paying their bill in Karachi. And you can see the Clifton and Defense areas are the sort of best performing. There's a university campus up there, and then in the periphery, there's sort of less bill payments. There's a core periphery effect, and in the center of the city, these richest areas are the ones where bills are being paid. Go on. So if we zoom in a little bit, right, what I've done is I've broken down the granularity of the map so that now you're looking at the feeder level. Previously, those units were about 500,000 people. The feeder is maybe 1,500 households or something like that. So at this map, what you see is the incredible heterogeneity that exists even within these areas, right? You're going right next to each other. You've got a high-performing area and a low-performing area, and what's going on, yeah? So Karachi Electric is remarkable for the extraordinary progress that they've made over the past 15 years in terms of reducing their losses. And yet, even then, there's many, many areas within their service domain where they're basically not that effective at getting people to pay their bills, right? So zooming in yet further, this is Liari, sort of like an area which you might be notorious for likelihood of poor governance, right? But even here you see, okay, number one is Machar Colony. Machar Colony is home to the most marginalized groups in Karachi. And unsurprisingly, it is a high-loss area, right? But what's unusual in this is like after the data point that of this particular chart, they led a transformation of Machar Colony so that Machar Colony was later, within 2 years, 3 years, was paying bills at the rate of the best areas, which is an incredible work that they did, but only achieved in working with the community to get there. West Wharf is where you have a lot of sort of offices of import-export companies and that sort of thing. They're obviously all paying their bills. In Denso Road, it's a commercial area in Liari, and it was paying its bills very well. I thought, oh, great, the commercial actors are doing that. But it's not. It's a blip in the data, which means that for 3 months out of those 12, there were negative losses. So within this data, these things are very noisy, very dirty. I know Ayesha's worked with this data set as well, and she did something which was to use a 3-month rolling average. I took actually 12 months of data there, but even there, within there, you get these quirks and noise, which is very unusual, right? So you can explore at that lower level these relationships, which I think are very relevant for understanding governance and relating to people in a distinctive way. So for me, understanding KE, this is work that I want to do, is to look a little more historically at how they achieved this, because their internal organizational transformation is underneath all of this, right? If you go to KE's offices, it doesn't look like a state company in any sense. It doesn't look like any other disco or utility. It looks like a professional organization, right? And that's incredible because when you think back, this isn't just a sort of pitch for privatization. When KE was first privatized, the first 5 or 7 years were horrific, right? They rioted, they burned things, they trashed the offices, nothing was working. And it's only after the gang war in Liari basically ends in 2012 that a lot of this transformation has really taken place. So there's a lot of other factors that do play in. But what I think we can do with this is those kinds of maps are a fantastic way to communicate both with elected representatives and their constituents, because people care about being served with the electricity supply in a way that matters to them. You can see that today's headlines, which I suspect is why Khurram Saab is not here, that they're talking about an electricity hike to counter the circular debt that Naveed Saab was talking about, with figures ranging from like 12 rupees hike to 30 rupees hike per unit, and pinning them specifically on the productive sectors of the economy, the industry and commerce, right? This is a solution to circular debt. And it's difficult to see that working out. Nonetheless, I think that a intervention based around using the visual, the spatial representation of these losses as a communication mechanism has some potential to work. So this is my book cover. The book just came out with Oxford. Unfortunately, not yet available in Pakistan, but hopefully soon. It's on Oxford Scholarship Online, so you can access it there. And if you still can't get it, just email me and I'll be happy to help you out. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Ayesha and Dr. Chima, Farah, and everyone at LAMS for having us here. I'll be presenting our joint work with Ayesha, Robyn, and a few other colleagues. If you think about Pakistan's electricity sector, it is really a classic case of poor management, lack of vision, excessive government control, and bad policies, and slow economic growth. Like in the late 80s and early 90s, we woke up to the reality that there is going to be an excess demand in the system, industrialization and surge in economic growth resulting in higher demand for appliances. But we didn't really plan for it. We didn't vision for that one. So therefore, the shorter solution was to invest in power plants, IPPs. So due to excess demand, we had to resort to electricity outages, load shedding. And now we have excess supply, and we still have to resort to load shedding. Why? Because we cannot really afford to generate that much of electricity. Although we have the system in place to supply electricity, but of course, poor demand and expensive energy mix prevent us to supply electricity to the capacity that is installed there. Okay. Now this paper is about the impact of a unique infrastructure improvement programs that was undertaken by Karachi Electric, which is the only private vertically integrated company in Pakistan. All others are under state control. There are like 11 distribution companies. Of 11, only one is under a private sector, right? And it was privatized in 2005, and then they gradually moved towards, having more effective implementations of their own policies to the extent they could do. Otherwise, electricity sector is controlled, as far as the pricing is concerned, is controlled by the government. NAPRA determines the prices, and the government notifies the prices. And up to some slabs, those prices are below the cost, therefore they have to give subsidy. And there are backlog of subsidies which really piles up our circular debts and so on. Okay, Ayesha can go. So, as you know, that the private entities are profit-making companies, right? Their sole objective is to make profit. So therefore, if they cannot make profit, they would not be able to make an investment in the system that is really needed to update the system according to the time, right? So, but then we know that there are massive technical and distribution losses, especially the prominent distribution companies where the losses are kind of very excessive are Quetta, electricity supply company, Peshawar, Sakhar, Hyderabad, Multan, and Karachi. And as Ijlal Sahab mentioned, Karachi has been K Electric has been very kind of effective and efficient in reducing the losses over time. But same is not the case with the other discos. And we think privatization is one of the key player in that game. Okay, now, non-technical losses and non-payment of bills, they really can have a massive financial burden on utilities, right? So therefore, they cannot really invest in the development of infrastructure, so therefore it results into poor quality services, and then the loop goes on. So they pose heavy fiscal challenges, not only for the company that's supplying electricity, but also in our case, to the government of Pakistan, right, in the shape of massive circular debt, right? And now, and not only that, given that we rely heavily, like 65% of our electricity generation is based on the fuel, fossil fuels, thermal, all that, right? So therefore, those are not a very cleaner way of producing electricity. So therefore, it has some implications for our environment as well, right? It does have implication for our ability to produce electricity because we depend, like 65% of our generation depends on the import of fossil fuels, right? Okay, if we move. Now, okay, yeah. So the two elements of T&D losses. One is that electricity is sent from where it is produced through the grid to the feeder to the transformers. So some of the electrons are wasted through the lines, and those are called technical losses, right? And given that our infrastructure is dilapidated, poor, so losses may be a little bit more than the losses that we see on average in the world, right? But a major portion of the T&D losses is because of the engagement of stealing electricity by the citizens, okay? And that can happen through meter tampering, that can happen to hooking the illegal wires with the main service wires, which is in our language is called kunda, right? And non-payment of bills. If you can move. Okay. So there have several solutions been tested in Pakistan, mostly in the world, to manage T&D losses. And our focus here is that the unique infrastructure improvement which was done by the KE, Karachi Electric, which simply is this, that they insulated with a thick coating, plastic coating, the service wires outside the house, which means that the wires that are coming from transformers and connecting through the small poles and then to the meters, those wires were coated so that it becomes difficult for connecting kunda to those wires, unless you really puncture the wire, right? Otherwise, the kunda was pervasive in Karachi and costing heavily. So that was one infrastructure improvement that was done. So go on. So the question that we are asking in this paper, in this project, is that can this infrastructure improvement could reduce T&D losses and also improve revenue recovery? And if yes, what really is the mechanism of that? And what are the effects on consumers? Obviously, consumers, those who are using kunda, they'll be worse off, right? They won't be able to easily connect kundas to the main wires and steal electricity. So what are the effects on them? But then what are the effects on the formal consumers, those who are not stealing electricity? What are the consequences for them? So we'll see both. And what are the implications of this program for our pollution, like CO2 parameters, right? If we move on. So we're talking about Karachi, most populated city in Pakistan. A lot of ethnicities live there, lots of complications, highly congested, tense areas in Karachi where the control and command is extremely difficult, right? For both administrative reasons as well as political reasons, right? And I'm sure we all know about that. So there are, like, Karachi Electric has divided the city into 30 administrative areas, and they're called Integrated Business Centers, IBCs. So now you can see the work they undertook, that they are removing kundas, right? And here they are installing meters, dysfunctional meters, the new meters. Some are smart meters. And here these are the insulated wires, like on the bare wires they are putting the coating of heavy, thick plastic materials, right? So here, this is the overtime implementation that happened in this program, right? So you could see that after 2017, they expedited the program and then, covered more and more than before the feeders, right? And they also adopted the ring fencing strategy, which is that knowing that this could create some spillovers, which means that if I'm not able to steal from this feeder or PMT, maybe I could pay a little bit more to steal electricity from my next neighbor PMT, which comes from different feeder. Okay. So, if you can move, right? So, this is the phase-wise implementation of ABC states done in Karachi. This is the area of Mango, Pir, Layari, so basically the west side of Karachi. So you could see that from 2016, over time, the intensity of implementation increased, and now in 2020, we could see that lots of feeders were ABC'd. Now, utility feeder level data, we get data on the customer's level, on different factors, and we also conducted surveys in Karachi, and we also got data for those individuals we interviewed in Karachi. So what are the distribution losses? So basically, let's say this is a feeder that provides electricity to 200 PMTs in the area. So this feeder sends like 100 units at a given time. But then you are able to see that consumers consumed only 70 units. So that means 30% are D&D losses in that feeder. If we assume that 5% are technical losses, the rest 25% are due to theft. Okay, if you can move. Move. Yeah. So here, our simple econometric model, here we look at the effect of ABCs on different outcome variables. So what really gives us a very clean strategy is this, that we could compare the feeders that were ABC'd to those that were not ABC'd and over time, right? So that gives us nice identification effect of ABCs on the outcome variables. Rest, my colleague Robyn will pick from here. Thank you.
So as Javed said, we will look at the impacts of this intervention on 3 categories of outcomes. So we'll look at the impacts for the electricity utility, we'll look at the impacts of the ABCs for the consumers, and then we'll try to say something about the impacts of the ABC intervention on different climate outcomes, okay? So first, with losses, losses and revenue recovery are the 2 main categories we're interested in for the electricity utility. Okay, so losses on the left, revenue recovery on the right. So what I would like to point out to you here is that on the y-axis, we have the months relative to the start of the ABC conversion process. Okay, so what you can see here is once the blue dots start, then the ABC conversion process within a feeder line has started. Now, what you can note is that there's sort of, with losses, a slow decline over a few months. You can think of that as sort of the intensity of the treatment. More of the PMTs within the feeder line are being treated, so it's systematically the treatment intensity is getting larger, so we're seeing sort of the impact growing over time, okay? And then what you want to interpret the y-axis as being the percentage point change over time. Next slide, please. So here what we have is the same slide, but we have added on our coefficients from our difference in differences estimates. So as Javed said, we're using the differences over time and space in terms of this implementation of the ABC intervention, okay? So what we see here is there is an 8.2 percentage point decrease in losses following the installation of the ABCs and a 5.2 percentage point increase in the revenue recovery, okay? And we can actually compare those to the means, and we see this is actually a 31% decrease for losses and a 6% increase in revenue recovery. So that's quite substantial, okay? Now, in addition to these event studies that I'm showing here and the difference in difference estimates we have on the figures, we do a number of robustness checks to make sure that we're dealing with confounders or spatial spillovers, dealing with any potential concerns with staggered difference in differences. And in addition, and we find that everything is robust. Our results are robust to all of those robustness checks. We then look to see if there's any differences in terms of the intensity of treatment. So if there's a greater proportion of the PMTs within a feeder line that are treated, does that have an bigger impact? And yes, we do find that's the case, okay? Wait, sorry, back. And then we also do a heterogeneity analysis, and we actually find that the feeder lines that were sort of worse off, either in terms of losses or revenue recovery, actually have the greatest impacts. So it's having the greatest impacts on the feeder lines that needed it the most. Next slide. Okay, so then we wanted to see, well, how did they have this impact? What are the mechanisms? And so first we looked at the numbers of formal customers, okay? And so column 1 is the total number of consumers for KE, but then columns 2 through 5 break this down by the different types of customers. And what you can see is, we see that following the ABC introduction, there is a significant increase in the number of customers. And if you look to column 5, you see this is driven by residential consumers. So we interpret this as being that there's this formalization of people that were previously using the kundas that Javed explained. They are being sort of formalized, brought online as formal consumers after the introduction of the ABCs. Okay, so then the other line of mechanisms that we look at is in terms of at the household level, using this household level data for these 3,000 households. We have the individual level data from KE, and we look at, well, how did the ABCs impact individual household level behavior? What we see is the ABCs led to an increase in both the billed units and then also the monetary value of the bills, okay? We see that people pay a higher ratio of the amount that they're billed, and there's a lower probability that they won't pay their bill at all in a given month, okay? And then in columns 5 and 6, what we see is less signs of different indicators of theft, okay? What I just wanted to add was that we actually do heterogeneity analysis in here, and we try to look at the differences to see if there's any differences between sort of the poorest, the extremely poor within our sample, and the less poor, and we're not finding any significant differences there. Next slide. Okay, so given that we're seeing some impacts for the utility on losses, we want to do some analysis in terms of cost benefits for the utility. So I'm not going into much detail here, but we can do different scenarios in terms of the costs of this ABC program for KE under different assumptions. And then we can use different assumptions to also get at the benefits of this ABC intervention to the utility over the 10-year lifespan that's expected for these ABCs. And what we see here, we see a pretty wide range in terms of the net present value of the cost versus the benefits across our different scenarios. But what I would just point out is, even in our sort of most conservative scenario with our highest discount rate, we still find that the benefits outweigh the costs. Okay, next slide. So then it begs the question, well, what happens to the consumers? How are they impacted? So I just want to spend a moment of sort of giving you a bit of conceptual framework as to how we might think that the consumers might be impacted by this conversion to the ABCs. So on this slide, we're just focusing on the formal consumers. These are the consumers who have always been formal consumers. They haven't been using the kundas. So when the ABCs come online, the price that they pay doesn't change. They're still paying the formal price that's set by the regulator as they were before the ABCs. So given that the price is remaining constant, if the electricity rationing, the load shedding, if it's non-binding or it doesn't change, these consumers are no worse off than they were before the ABCs. But if actually after the ABCs are installed, if the load shedding, the rationing is lessened, so they have more hours under which they can receive electricity services, then these consumers will be better off because they would be able to consume more hours of electricity services, okay? So this is sort of the equivalent conceptual framework for the individuals that are using the kundas, okay? So what we see from them is that, first of all, one thing that we haven't noted much yet in the presentation, through different focus groups that we conducted before we conducted our household survey, what we found was that a lot of the consumers that were using these kundas, they actually were paying a positive price for their kundas on a monthly basis. So I think popular assumption tends to be that these people are actually receiving electricity for free, but what we were finding was they were actually paying some positive price. It just wasn't going to KE, it was going to some informal provider, okay? So that's one thing that we have here that I wanted to note was there is this fee that the kunda users have to pay that we were learning about, okay? But still, when the ABCs are introduced, if these consumers have to shift then from being kunda users to becoming formal consumers for the electricity utility, they have to shift to this formal price, right? So they're gonna experience this price increase, assuming that the kunda fee that they were previously paying was less than the formal price, okay? Not yet. But the other thing that I wanted to note was just that depending on whether or not the load shedding is binding or non-binding, as on the left side, that will actually determine how whether or not the consumers are better off, potentially better off than they were before the ABCs. Because depending on the difference between the formal price and the prior price that they were paying, and then if there's any changes in load shedding, after the ABC intervention, it's possible that these consumers might actually be better off overall. Next slide. Okay, so we do some calculations to look at the change in how well off the consumers are in terms of consumer surplus. And we do these for a range of these different kunda fees. And this range of fees is based on the range of fees that we were getting reported to us in our focus groups. Except for the zero, no one reported a zero value to us. And so what you can see from this, the simple message is just that for these calculations for average consumers, we see that as the kunda fee is higher, then actually that impact of ABCs on the consumers is not as large, right? It's dampened. Next slide. Okay? So we have some supporting evidence as to the fact that we think that the consumers might actually be experiencing less load shedding and better service quality after the ABCs are provided. One point of this of evidence in this respect is that we see that the technical complaints go down. These are complaints that the consumers make to the electricity utility. These go down following the installation of the ABCs. Next slide. Okay. And then also, we have supporting evidence. This is based on our household survey that we did of these approximately 3,000 households that are KE customers. And what we found was that this is just cross-sectional, so we don't interpret it as causal, but some interesting differences between the households that are in areas that have been covered by the ABCs and those that have not yet been covered by the ABCs, okay? And what we see is these households that are in the area covered by the ABCs are more likely to say they're less concerned about a shortage of electricity, they're less concerned about load shedding than the areas that do not yet have ABCs. But they're also more concerned about how well their bill from KE actually accurately reflects their usage. And they're more likely to say that they think that their bill has electricity errors, okay? Okay, so far what we've presented is showing, we think the utility is better off from the ABC, if we go back, from the ABC installation. We think it's ambiguous as to how much the consumers are affected, and it definitely varies depending on whether the consumer was a formal consumer or an informal Kunda user prior to the intervention. So now what we want to see is, okay, well, were there any impacts on the environment? Okay, so we want to see, can we say anything about the impacts of the intervention in terms of electricity generation and avoided CO2 emissions? Next slide. Okay, so our intervention and a lot of what we're doing is at the feeder line level. We obviously don't have generation data at the feeder line level, but what we can do is use a proxy for electricity generation at the feeder line level, because we know how much electricity was sent out, which is sort of delivered. We know how much electricity is delivered to each of the feeder lines in each month, okay? So we can see here what is the impact of the ABC intervention on the quantity of electricity that's delivered to each feeder line over time. And what we see is that there was a significant and substantial reduction in the amount of electricity that was being sent out to feeder lines following the installation of ABCs. Okay, next. And so what we can do with that is then make some calculations, and these are sort of back-of-the-envelope calculations, as to what this means in terms of avoided CO2 emissions. And what we have to do for this is make some assumptions about what's the marginal generator that would be responding to these changes in terms of electricity demand, okay? So we sort of make assumptions about sort of what is the marginal responder here. It could be residual fuel oil, coal, or natural gas, or it could be some combination of those three, which is the responsive blend that we've put there. But the note that I want to make is that if this is the case, based on our numbers in terms of the reduction in the electricity sent out to these feeder lines, then this reduction in, or avoided CO2 emissions is, for the responsive blend, 2.77% less, 2.77% of the total CO2 emissions that KE has from generation in a year. Okay, so it's not inconsequential. It doesn't represent an inconsequential savings in terms of avoided CO2 emissions. Next slide. Okay, so to conclude, what we've found here is that the utility seems to be definitely benefiting from this ABC intervention in terms of losses are going down, revenue recovery is going up. We find that the main mechanism seems to be that the total number of metered customers is going up, although we also do find that billed consumption increases and theft decreases, okay? We find that there are these consumer effects, but an important takeaway for us is that these changes in consumer surplus from ABCs, they vary very much not only across the formal and the Kunda users, but even then within the Kunda users, they vary depending on how much, what was the Kunda fee that people were paying prior to the ABC intervention, okay? And so that will greatly affect how much they are negatively affected by this ABC intervention. Okay, and what we do see is we have reports, and I didn't get into all of the details of the results we have here, but we do have reports of less load shedding in the areas with the ABCs. So it does seem as though with this introduction of the ABCs, there's less losses. The utility seems to be responding with less load shedding, okay? We find that in terms of the cost-benefit analysis across a range of scenarios, this leads to a positive net present value. And then in terms of environmental implications, we find that our proxy for electricity generation goes down, and our proxy for CO2 emissions or avoided CO2 emissions also goes down. So thank you very much.
A big thank you to all the speakers, Dr. Naveed, Ijlal, Javed, and Robyn. Since we've heard a number of different perspectives coming from different disciplines, I thought it would be kind of useful to have a discussion which sort of synthesizes, keeping in mind, the goals of the conference, which is, pathways to development. So essentially, thinking of what do we sort of take away from these different pieces of research. So let me try to ask, 3 different questions which kind of synthesize and touch upon the research of all 3 projects. So first kind of question which, as someone who's attending the conference or as someone who's studying the economy of Pakistan, I guess for every session, where we're talking about reforms is, which reforms are needed or what do we need to do to fix the problem where we find ourselves in. And we don't want to kind of dwell too much on the sort of magnitude of the problem. We understand it's big. It's one of the biggest sort of challenges confronting Pakistan's economy. But I think we sort of want to leave the room with some informed insight on which reforms are needed. And I think Naveed's perspective, Ijlal's perspective, I think are both valuable. So I thank Ijlal for sort of reminding us, that understanding the challenges which we face today requires an understanding of the governance, the institutional structures, whether they be formal or informal, and the kind of power relationships which exist and which shape the incentives of all actors, be they customers who sort of arriving at the utility or interacting with the utility on a day-to-day basis, whether they be service providers who are essentially utility officers, or whether they be local or federal politicians or policy makers. So it is important. While we are forward-looking, while we kind of want to consider reforms or interventions which we hope and think would work, we do want to understand the sort of context in which these reforms will be played out, right? And what then will underscore the sort of way in which these reforms affect and have an impact or not, okay? So that's important. And then, but that shouldn't make us despondent because we, of course, understand that cultures, power relationships are there and slow-moving. But we shouldn't be despondent that, look, we are doomed because we are just part of this kind of, vicious or bad equilibrium. Dr. Naveed, brings in a very sort of problem-focused kind of agenda where he says, look, there are certain low-hanging fruits. These are what they call the zero times zero investment interventions. Well, yes, if we study this from a purely technical perspective, yes, these could be sort of one way out where we sort of push really hard on actualizing these. And, while we sort of want to think about that, but we want to set them up for success, right? So I think one of the kind of key sort of messages from the end of the presentation, which Dr. Naveed made, was the role of behaviors and nudges. So I think that could be sort of one way in which we sort of operationalize these low-hanging fruits where, when Robyn came in over this weekend to Lahore, this was her first time in Pakistan, I mentioned to her, look, Robyn, we're not a nation of early risers, or at least we sort of start everything late. No shops will be open before 11, so we better plan our day that way. And so we never use the daylight saving time, right? And that is sort of a big cost to us. As a nation which is generating really expensive electricity, here is a cheap substitute which is available, but we don't utilize it. Why don't we? And Ijlal talked about the kind of changes which happened previously. We had this, but people didn't change their behaviors. How can we get people to change their behaviors? I think those are the kind of questions which we need to sort of really push on. While solutions might be there, why are they not happening, right? So that's the kind of challenge which I think, as researchers, as young people, as entrepreneurs, or people who want to perhaps, spend more time on this and think about solutions, well, these are the kind of things which, in my opinion, we should be thinking about and taking the discussion sort of towards converging, where we bring together different viewpoints and we take the strengths from each viewpoint and we try to find the approach which will work given the context which we are in. So I'm cautiously optimistic. If you ask me the question, which reforms are needed? Well, yes, people at the Lums Energy Institute have done a lot of work on this, and they've identified some really nice changes which could be brought about without much sort of cost. So we could take those, or we could bring to bear a lot other research which is happening and think about ways in which we can operationalize this. Second question is, which is, well, this menu of reforms looks great, but how do I know if, let's say, we pick one of these, let's say we have permanent daylight saving, how do I actually know that this reform worked? What are the kind of impacts that it had? And that's where I think the value of kind of work which Robyn, Javed, and co-authors are doing, which comes in. Well, it may be retrospective, but it still helps us understand if something worked, why it worked, or if something failed, then why it failed. Reform is an iterative process. And we cannot sort of make it all or nothing strategy where we either do it or don't do it. We have to keep on trying because ex ante we cannot be sure what will work. And this requires both a willingness to be informed. So on the part of the utility, let's say Karachi Electric, which engaged on that particular project, and they were helpful enough to provide such detailed data. So that requires a willingness to be informed, right? Because whatever you find may not necessarily be what you sort of hope to kind of find out or to put in the kind of public sphere. And so it requires the willingness to be informed and requires sort of very good data to be made available to actually scientifically tease out the effect of reforms, which are not happening experimentally, right? So we're not controlling what happens. They're sort of these natural experiments which happen according to policy changes. And even if you rely on qualitative data, the kind of data which Ijlal gathered, right? So I think being data-driven is really, really important to understand how or why reforms worked or not, okay? And I think Dr. Naveed made a very good point here where he said that as academics, we tend to kind of speak to academic audiences. That's what we do most of the time. But the decision makers have very little time. They want to understand in very simple words, what is it that we're trying to communicate? So that's, I think, something which we need to work on more, whereas academics, we need to do a better job communicating. And that can then eventually help build coalitions amongst the policymakers, people who matter in terms of making decisions for different reforms. Now, third thing, sort of looking forward, and here, this is an area for open discussion. I hope we can have more discussion once I finish my comments. The third question is, how can we make the reforms work? Let's say we agreed on a set of reforms or whatever it is that we want to do, these different interventions. We could also decide this is how we're going to evaluate the impact. Then the third thing is, how do we set up reforms for success? Well, this is actually, in my opinion, the most difficult question. Where there are several moving parts. So let me, I guess, describe in a big way, which I think, where the power sector, the electricity sector especially, and most of the other utilities such as, gas as well, we find ourselves in sort of this bad equilibrium, where this cycle of kind of, negative reinforcing effects, which so we start with loss-making utilities, they cannot upgrade infrastructure, people don't trust them, they deliver poor services, people don't want to pay bills, people resort to theft, so this kind of vicious cycle keeps on happening, okay? On the other side, we've got, expensive electricity because of the kind of, generation setup we have, we rely on imported fossil fuels. So that keeps the electricity cost high, and even with subsidies, electricity prices are high, right? For all types of customers, and that then also affects people's willingness to pay, where they feel that electricity should be something which is a basic commodity, it's a basic aspect of modern life, should be available to us at affordable prices, but it's not. So this kind of vicious cycle or bad equilibrium is where we find ourselves to be in, where there are sort of rays of hope, where different pieces of reforms, which utilities such as Karachi Electric have been implementing and carrying out with varying degrees of success, have been working. But still, in order to kind of take us from this bad equilibrium towards a good equilibrium, more coordinated action is needed, okay? For example, we didn't discuss the issue of electricity pricing, but that is, I guess, a classic kind of example where you see economists on one hand sort of saying, look, we need to price electricity at cost. If we want to support low and poor households and low-income households, we need to give them direct subsidies. That could take the form of cash transfers or in-kind transfers or whatever it is in the social security system it is. But why are we giving this subsidy on electricity where most of the subsidy ends up going into the pocket of rich households? But that message is very hard to communicate. And for that particular reason, in my opinion, I think that it's very hard to build a coalition around reform for pricing of electricity, right? So how do we do that? And that I've picked an example, which is, I think, in my opinion, the most challenging one. Well, I think here, coalition building is important. So coordination is important, where we need different sources of messaging. Perhaps the kind of messaging which Ijlal was talking about, where you show, people maps or the consequences of, what this pricing mechanism has done, right? Or you try to communicate these messages to them in a simpler way, the consequences of sort of treating electricity as a sort of common resource, right? Which then, leads the sector into all this kind of trouble. And this changing of mindset would, of course, take time. It's not going to happen overnight. And of course, it also requires, people who are influential, policymakers, perhaps people who are influential on media to play a role and help build these kind of coalitions. And also for academics to have the message out sort of more clearly in order to support, these different reforms. So that's just one example in my opinion. I think that was it's challenging to do, but I think it's important to reflect on how to make reforms work. I'll end my discussion here, but I'll invite all the panelists up on the stage so we can have an open Q&A.
My question is for Javed and Robyn. Did you see any behavior change on part of the consumers? So, for example, did you see that they shifted their energy consumption on the feeders which had this reform rollout? Did they shift their energy consumption from nighttime to daytime when energy is cheaper, from the high load time to the low load time when energy is cheaper? Number one. And number two, I'm sorry I didn't exactly catch how long of a time series do you have. I'm sort of curious if the consumers have started finding a way to sort of steal the electricity again in some ways.
Do you want me to respond?
To your first point, do we see a change in the behavior of consumers? Actually, this is our next study. We will. Inshallah, fingers crossed. Now, the thing is that one behavior change, which is, I think, the direct outcome of this program is this, that is a forced change in behavior, which is that you make it expensive for the consumers to steal electricity. Those who were not stealing electricity, there is no change in behavior. In fact, stealing becomes even more costlier for them. But those who were stealing electricity, it has become a bit more difficult for them. So transaction cost of stealing has gone up with that. But, so that's a good part of it. So which really is the intended policy outcome. My worry is this, that once you develop a stealing behavior or bad behavior, it becomes very difficult to adopt honest behavior. So for how long you can really control your patience when you have to cut down electricity by half and pay electricity bill more than what you were paying for using Kunda, right? So my worry is that they will circumvent the way around, which is not that difficult. Like if you can hook the Kunda with the service wire, how difficult it is for you to puncture the wire and do the same thing again. Although KE has increased surveillance, but mafias may also increase price, right? It's just a little bit more price, right? Hopefully it may change the behavior with not just this one intervention alone, but of course with the myriad of interventions coming from here and there, community engagement, moral lessons, and making it more costly, surveillance, and something around that. So hopefully, once we adopt a good behavior, let us hope that we stick to the good behavior. And it's not only that, it is actually people are appreciating the improvement in service quality because of ABCs. The tripping is less than before. They are using more appliances. So they're not worried as much about some outages of their refrigerator or machines or whatever, right? So hopefully they see the dividend of such change and they adopt good behavior for good. But that is something that time will show. Your other question, go ahead. What was your other question?
Well, I think so I was actually going to try and answer what I think was the other question, which was how long were you able to look after? And it's about 36 months, just under. So that's sort of as long as we can go out right now with our data. But that's right. That's a decent amount of time. I mean, I think if you had asked me prior to the study, I would have said if we were going to see people learning how to sort of puncture the new cables, maybe we'd see that after a year. But to go out this far is actually longer than I thought that would hold.
I am Ajaz from NUST. My question is with Dr. Naveed. We have seen K Electric overcoming their transmission and distribution losses over the decade. Can that model of DISCO be replicated in other 10 DISCOs to reduce their losses from 20% to below?
So I think certainly that model can be replicated, given that Karachi has been a difficult locale to work with. And they have reduced the losses from 40 to 16%, I believe. But let me tell you an inside news. KI does not make money in distribution sector. It's a vertically integrated company. So even with the losses of 16%, they're not making money on the distribution side. They're making money on the generation side, where they optimize the generation to a level where the cash cow is there. And overall, KI gives they got a profitability of 8 billion rupees last year. But that's coming from the generation side. In Pakistan, the problem is that if the DISCOs are just independent, generation is not under their control. So if even the losses are reduced to a certain level, they have to reduce absolutely to a very low level for them to make profit. So that's a tricky thing. But we have to start. K is a good example that we can follow.
There's a question in the middle. Hold it.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Dr. Ayesha and Economics Department for having this wonderful conversation. And I have actually one question from every one of you. Starting from, my name is Atif Arif, and I'm a LUMS graduate as well as I'm working in Bank of Punjab as Vice President. So Dr. Naveed Saab, you show a duck curve. And right now, all of Pakistanis are being told that the solar is the next thing, go to the on-grid. There are renewable energy mixes. So at the policy level, if everyone like me is investing like 1 million and above, having a solar, and in the 5 years down time, we will having that duck curve in Pakistan or in Lahore, so what will be the implications? So as Dr. Javed told us that in 90s there were IPPs based on fuels, and then there is captive power plants, and now we have coal power things. So the policy decision is like every one of us who is affording a solar plant will be having it, and in 5 years or 10 years, like we have CNGs in the 90s and 2000, everyone was having a CNG cylinder, and suddenly, as a banker, we invested millions and billions of rupees in financing those CNG plants, and everyone is wiped out because the energy is, just happened. So this is my first question. So can I questions everyone? Or get
sure. So if we can start with Dr. Naveed,
sure.
and then Ijlal.
See, there are two parts to electricity infrastructure. One is the infrastructure cost, which is typically a standard cost. That's not you cannot recover it back. And typically that infrastructure is planned according to the maximum that can deliver. So even for 1 minute, if that infrastructure should be delivering 30,000 megawatt, we have to make it according to 30,000 megawatt. So if we do not use it for the rest of the year, that's a standard cost. So the problem with the utility company is that although we are saying that, okay, we are installing solar and we are bringing renewable to the grid, the evening load has to, conform to that maximum load or an increase in load there. But there are lessons from the world that we can learn. Rather than following their path and going to a disaster stage, we can learn the disaster. If we look at both the angles of solar as well as our gas sector. So the gas sector is depleting. Energy sector, we have excess capacity. So if you use solar, you can compensate for the gas reduction that we will be receiving. So solar water heater, solar, maybe the cook stoves, space heating, those can be, we can encourage that. In fact, there's a whole industry that can come out of it. And on top of that, what we can do is maybe look at some newer solution of battery storage and other things that can reduce the impact on the grid. But you're right, this is a phenomena, the curve phenomena is real. K Electric is starting to see it because they are a private company and they can see, and the CXO was here last week and she was telling us that they are seeing that their duck curve is coming, not 5 years down the road, next year.
Solar is, in most cases, solar is your individual decision that I want to have a solar panel on my rooftop. So there I will internalize the cost of having a solar and then compare it to the benefits that I will draw from that, maybe in the next 5 years. So given that now the batteries are more powerful and that battery prices have gone down actually in the past years, quite actually substantially. And you can see that many, even middle-income households do have solars out there. So we should try to incentivize them so that they can use more and more of solar. Net metering is one aspect. Other is obviously some tax relief on buying solars or all that. So that is right. And with respect to installed capacity or all that we have, that is basically the government problem, which really is falling on all of us, right? It's a mismanagement problem that you could not really foresee before 1990s that there would be an excess demand, the world is rising, you will have industrialization, you will have surge in demand because income level is going up, and you didn't really plan for anything as such. All you did was heavy, costly generation mix. And now you are asking the whole nation, and we have to pay the price, right? So obviously these are the issues. Now installed capacity. Obviously we have to. It's not that we have to have some installed capacity because some plants are down or there is surge in demand which cannot be forecasted 100% with 100% accuracy, right? But with that, my worry is that, let's say your installed capacity is 80%. You are asked to run your plant at 80%, but you run at much lower than that. The point is if the generator is on the standby, but there is, let's say there are mismanagements on the generation side, and as a result of that, 10 out of 4 plants are down. Who is responsible for this management? We all pay for it. Anyways, we'll stop.
I'd like to involve Ijlal and ask him on the solar question, not from the technical aspect, how we're going to kind of manage load, etc., but more so from this kind of relationship, which the consumer has with the utility, and at a bigger level with the state in terms of provision, where you could think of solar as sort of like, kind of trying to rely less and less on the utility or the state. So do you have any perspectives on that, and also with respect to your work with Karachi Electric, with ISCO, in terms of the field work you've done, how customers perceive their relationships with the utility and what affects that?
Sure. So one way in which solar I think is a no-brainer solution, and you saw it in Dr. Naveed's slides as well, is in the more remote areas, where it's just so expensive and pointless to be building a grid out. And there's the scales at which, like especially in these sort of niche solutions, Kachibali's is another one. What is the cost of a tiny solar panel? It's enough to charge your mobile phone and something basic like that. These are places we're already seeing deployment where people are having fantastic, they get a real benefit to their life as a result, which is very hard to solve in a different way. On the contrary, having lots of small solar generation in an environment which can be easily served by the grid is completely inefficient from an economics perspective. The efficiencies come from scale, right? But when it is done in another way, if you have feed-in tariffs that allow people to then take seriously the maintenance of these plants, I think that was a key element of Germany's expansion of solar power. So there's these things where the tariff has to be gotten right, and I know it's a terrifying proposition for the regulator to have to get that tariff at a level where they then realize that it's a cash flow implication, because if you price it at a level that is sufficient to invite people to put solar on all their houses and then sell it back to the grid, then you're going to have to pay these people. And so you're going to run into different kinds of problems when you set that up as well.
I just have one query from Dr. Javed and Dr. Robyn. Your research actually very resonated from a business graduate perspective, because you calculated the net present value. So from an entity perspective as well as a consumer perspective, if I see myself having contributed in terms of saving from a power entity, so this looks very nice. And at the same time, as a banker, we are more focused on ESG and the green banking concept these days, which are the buzzwords. And you also said that ABC actually has lowered the CO2 emissions. So it has a win-win thing. So the question is, why this, if this has already been done like 5 years ago by KE and you have got the results, why it hasn't been replicated by other discos, and why it has not been, taken forward at a government level to save money as well as to improve the reduction in CO2 levels?
I think I heard that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think I heard that it is going forward in different parts of the country now with, maybe someone else knows more about this, but.
Yeah. I think even with Karachi Electric, since I was a co-author on that project, there was a lot of resistance. So it was not easy to do this. So they had to do a lot of groundwork to kind of prepare the communities and build sort of like local support in these communities to actually begin the ABC work. Yeah. So I think that needs to be part of the strategy, wherever else it needs to kind of be replicated. I have a note from the organizers that we have to finish by 3:45. So okay. I would like to take any last questions because we just have 3 minutes. Yes.
My question is from Dr. Naveed. Pakistan is facing severe energy crisis. There are circular debt problems. Number one, what is the solution of this huge amounts of circular debt? Number two, you said that we all know that there are our gas reserves are rapidly depleting. What will be the alternative for the increasing demand of gas for domestic and industrial consumers?
Right. So for your first question about the circular debt, there are two things we need to solve concurrently. One is to reduce the accumulation of circular debt, and second one is to reduce the stock of it, which is already accumulated. And I think there is no easy answer to it, which means that we have to increase the revenue earnings from the power sector so that it can pay for its liabilities, or the government has to bring on some money from somewhere. So I cannot give a short answer, there's a long answer, but the thing is that we are working on a framework which can actually help reduce this hit. It's not easy to do it. First we have to go into a damage control mode where we have to make it to zero, hopefully, and then reduce the 4 trillion rupees or whatever. The second question about the gas sector, this is actually a big national level issue, that when the gas reserves will run out, what are we going to do? One thing is that we can start exploring more, although don't expect too many new discoveries because half of the reserves of Pakistan are already discovered according to GIS mappings. Maybe we can use the third coal to convert to hydrogen and maybe to other gases and then use this pipe network to transmit it. But these are quite out of box, lot of research required kind of solutions. And we have to start working now to find a solution in the next 10 years. The third thing is that probably we have to convert most our gas loads to electricity. Because our gas loads can be easily converted to electricity. I mean, in my house, I use now electricity as the main source of cooking, and it's perfectly fine. I use it for main source of water heating. It's perfectly fine. Same taste, by the way. So that's one thing. The second thing is we need to also work on the storage technologies, which is the lithium-ion batteries and other advanced storage, because that can give us help in terms of providing, rather than providing an LPG cylinder, you can provide a charged battery to somebody so that they can use, especially in remote areas. So these are some maybe out-of-box, more research kind of solutions, but there's no option. There's no easy option.
May I add gas reserve shortage? One possible solution is waste to energy. We can make gas through anaerobic digestion. We are fourth largest holder of buffaloes in the world. We are fourth largest buffaloes livestock in Pakistan, and we can make trillions of cubic feet gas. Karachi has converted their BRT buses fleet on biogas, and we can also convert that livestock through anaerobic digestion. We can make biogas, and it is not very expensive solution. It is one of the way forward.
Okay, so let's end here. Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you to the audience for a lively discussion. I will see you at the next session. Thank you.
Thank you.